President Trump today announced that White House counsel Don McGahn, who is a key witness in the special counsel's investigation into potential obstruction of justice, will soon be making his exit. Quote, Don McGahn will be leaving his position in the fall shortly after the confirmation, hopefully, of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. I have worked with Don for a long time and truly appreciate his service. The tweet effectively confirmed the timeline for McGahn's departure, which was first reported by Axios this morning. However, the Washington Post then revealed another twist in today's development that, quote, Trump's announcement of McGahn's departure came as a surprise, including to McGahn. And that is because, according to a source, quote, McGahn had not discussed his plans directly with Trump. Trump's announcement today comes after the New York Times reported last week that McGahn has cooperated extensively with the special counsel, speaking to investigators for over 30 hours in total. That news reportedly rattled the president, who realized, quote, he did not know what Mr. McGahn had shared with Mueller's team. Despite that reporting, the president today insisted he is not concerned with what McGahn told Mueller.
He'll be moving on, probably the private sector, maybe the private sector, and he'll do very well. But he's done an excellent job.
Any concern about what he said to the Mueller team?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Joining me now is Elie Honig, a former federal prosecutor, and Jonathan Swan, a national political reporter with Axios. Jonathan, just to the nuts and bolts of this first, folks looking at the timeline here would see the cooperation with the Mueller investigation, the decision today. Is there a connection there?
Several of other reporters have reported that there's a connection. I don't know one way or another. I've been trying to find out all day, and I haven't been able to nail it down to my satisfaction. What I can tell you is that Trump has long had a strained relationship with Don McGahn. He's been fed up with him at different times. They've had pretty heated discussions where the president has become exasperated with him. In the president's mind, according to people who've watched the two of them interact and talk to the president about Don McGahn, Trump thought that Don McGahn was always trying to get to no, was never trying to creatively get to yes when he had a request. Don McGahn's defenders say, well, that's because Trump was often asking him to do things that were potentially illegal and certainly unwise. So they say he was in a difficult position from day one, and they're quite sympathetic to him.
Elie, in terms of this question here, this issue of cooperating with Mueller's investigation, is there a difference in terms of the role he could play with Mueller being the current White House counsel or in the former White House counsel? Does that affect the relationship at all with Mueller's team?
So I think where it comes into play is if McGahn were to stick around and continue to be in these conversations with the president, those future conversations could now become subject to Mueller, which may be a reason for the timing here, may be a reason why the president said, OK, I think the president was already freaked out by the 30 hours, and he should be. 30 hours is an eternity for a prosecutor to spend with somebody. It means that the person's got something of interest. I would never spend more than 3 hours with somebody who had nothing of interest. And so now that McGahn's gone, he won't be in the room, and he won't be able to report on that to the prosecutor.
Does that suggest to you, when you say that's a long amount of time, they must be interested in something in particular, does that suggest to you, folks would look at this question of obstruction of justice, of the firing of James Comey, of maybe advice Trump was getting, what he was being told inside the White House? Does it suggest anything about that to you?
I think that's exactly where I would go. McGahn seems to have been one of the main sources of sort of moderation and restraint. And as Jonathan alluded to, maybe his cardinal sin was that he would tell the president no. And sometimes the best advice a lawyer can give a client, it's not easy to give, is no, don't do that. And, the most important thing, the most interesting thing to me as a prosecutor would be those conversations around the potential firing of Mueller. It's been reported that McGahn was the one who talked the president out of that or told the president you can't or should not do that. And I would want to know, if I was a prosecutor sitting with McGahn, why did he want to do it? What did he tell you were his reasons for wanting to do it? And if the answer is he was freaked out about Russia, which I would guess it was, that could be really important evidence.
Jonathan, then the question is, what's next, or who's next for Trump in that role of White House counsel? And also the reaction of Republicans in Washington. I know Mitch McConnell today sounded distressed about this possibility.
The Mitch McConnell statement was very amusing, at least to my eyes, because the first sentence said, if the reporting is accurate. This was after I broke the story, and then the president on the record confirmed it. So there was no reporting, whatever. But what I saw from that was a sense of wishful denial. Here's the issue. Don McGahn is an ideological conservative who, in Mitch McConnell's mind, in Chuck Grassley's mind, has done a wonderful job feeding that pipeline of conservative justices, both at the circuit court level and obviously at the Supreme Court level. Emmett Flood, who is the likely replacement. However, I should stress nothing has been formalized. Emmett Flood is not known for his ideology. He represented Bill Clinton during the impeachment, and he represented George W. Bush for 2 years during his second term, and now he's obviously coming in to represent Trump. Someone, a source of mine who has discussed Emmett Flood's decision-making, said that one of the reasons he came in for Trump is because he believes that these special counsels are out of control. So it was very much from that very specific vantage point, protecting the institution of the presidency in his mind, that he took the job. There's less of a sense that he has conservative bona fides.
And today's announcement of McGahn's looming departure comes amid reports indicating that Trump wants to fire his attorney general, Jeff Sessions. And now, just tonight, Politico reporting that the president is personally asking Republican senators to turn against Sessions. Quote, the willingness of Republican senators to turn on Attorney General Jeff Sessions is the result of a furious lobbying campaign from President Trump, who for the past 10 days has been venting his anger at Sessions to any senator who will listen, according to one GOP Senate aide. Ellie, this issue of potentially getting rid of Sessions, to me, we were talking about this last night. Some folks were suggesting a key element of the timeline here is the status of the Mueller investigation. If the Mueller investigation is going on and Trump moves on Sessions versus if the Mueller investigation is finished and he moves on Sessions, how key is that date to you?
I think it's hugely important because, again, it goes to the intent. If obviously the president's biggest beef with Sessions is that Sessions recused himself and handed over the Mueller investigation to Rosenstein and Mueller, who have some streak of independence in them. And so I think if you wait until the investigation is done, he can't really be criticized for that. But if he does it before the investigation is done, and given how quickly this is moving and the president's sort of famous impatience, I would bet that's the way it goes. Maybe after midterms, but I don't think he's going to let this run all the way out until Mueller's done. Then again, it goes to the president's intent on obstruction. It goes back to the president's sort of fundamental misunderstanding of the roles of everyone around him. He comes from a world where if you work anywhere near me, you work for me, Donald J. Trump. But in fact, all these individuals, well, many of them, including Jeff Sessions, understand that you don't work for the president personally. Don McGahn understands you work for the institution of the presidency, but not this person.
And Jonathan, quickly, these Republican senators, look, if it comes to it, say it was after midterms and Trump got rid of Sessions, are there potentially, it would not take many Republicans saying no to that to keep a replacement from being confirmed? Are there, hey, Sessions was in the Senate for a long time. He's got some friends, some allies there. Are there potentially a critical number of Republicans who would say no to that?
Sure. I mean, who do you replace him with? That's the question. I don't have a sense that the Trump or people around him have played out this tape to the end. You fire Sessions, okay, who do you install to replace him? Someone who's going to fire Rosenstein? If that type of a person who's going to be a lackey is going to be toxic to a lot of these senators. So, yeah, maybe they will roll over and do it because they're Republicans and they'll do it for President Trump. But I think it's going to be a very tough confirmation.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.